Hola, amigas, amigos, bienvenidos a Cómics XXI. Yo soy Marcos Ordóñez y en esta ocasión vamos a sumergirnos en el mundo de EC Comics, una editorial que en los años 50 barrió, tuvo unas tiradas espectaculares, ganó muchísimo dinero, pero cuando estaba en su mejor momento cayó estrepitosamente. Ahí se juntaron los intereses de dos personas. El doctor Frederick Wertham, ávido de notoriedad, y el senador que convocó el subcomité del Senado porque él, que era un látigo de la mafia, sabía que en la distribución de cómics la Cosa Nostra tenía un control sobre esa red y quería pillarlos. En medio estuvo EC, que pagó las consecuencias. En el vídeo vamos a ver el porqué de toda esa historia y deciros que habrá un segundo vídeo. Realmente el contenido es muy amplio, no nos cabía todo aquí y hemos decidido ofreceros una segunda entrega. Muy bien, amigas, amigos, gracias. Hasta la próxima.
Are comic books good or are they not good? If you want to raise a generation that is half stormtroopers and half cannon fodder with a dash of illiteracy, then comic books are good. In fact, they are perfect. Just a very short while ago, an 11-year-old boy committed a holdup in California and killed a woman of 42. And when the police came to arrest this 11-year-old boy, his older brother, who's 20, said, if you want to know the cause of all this, here it is. It's these rotten comic books. Cut them out, and things like this would not happen.
Superman itself is the symbol of force, power, and violence. That is what he represents. And that has had an enormous influence, which one cannot possibly exaggerate, on the youth, not only of this country, but of the youth of many other countries, you see, especially in Germany. It is utterly impossible to understand what happened in Germany, all the different massacres and so on, unless you realize that they were imbued with this Superman spirit. It represents the abolition of law. The Superman is above the law, all laws, the democratic law, the real law, and even the law of physics and chemistry. He's a person to himself. So what you teach the young person, and incidentally the older person too, is that you have no responsibility. You have to appeal to one individual who will take care of everything. You know, have really tried that to jump over the banister, fan out and break their leg, or try to almost go out of the window. Or later on as men, when I served them as men, tell me, look, as a child, you know, I really thought you could fly. Thank God I didn't try it. And I know some who did try it. He represents superstition. So here you have violence, superstition, complete distrust in the community, complete distrust in the law, complete trust in a strong individual who can do things which cannot be done.
What do you think of the idea that Superman stands for truth and justice the American way?
Well, how can one stand for something which doesn't exist? It's very difficult, but he doesn't. For one thing, he doesn't. He comes at the last moment and flies through the air and helps. That's not what the girls know, who I know, who've been raped and killed and mutilated. They don't need somebody to fly to.
When an irresistible force such as you.
La violencia juvenil llegó antes que los cómics de terror de EC. En Estados Unidos existían unas 10.000 bandas callejeras en los años 50, compuestas por los hijos de inmigrantes irlandeses, italianos, latinos, asiáticos. Tenían su territorio y lo defendían a costa de lo que fuera. La violencia era su primer argumento. Max Gaines fue un editor de cómics que se hizo millonario con sus tebeos. En su editorial All American Comics nacieron personajes como Flash, Linterna Verde o Wonder Woman. Gaines tenía ventas de 8 millones de ejemplares por mes. Creó ECE como Educational Comics, pero falleció en un accidente y su hijo William hubo de hacerse cargo de la editorial cambiándola a Entertainment Comics. En 1948, un guionista y dibujante llamado Al Feldstein llegó a ECE y su conexión con William Gaines fue instantánea, convirtiéndose en su ayudante de edición. Iniciaron proyectos de cómics de diversos géneros: romance, bélico, western, policíaco, pero fueron un fracaso. Buscando nuevas ideas, decidieron entrar en el género del terror. Abrieron una new trend, una nueva tendencia, eliminando todos los productos anteriores y centrándose en diferentes monstruos del terror. Las ventas se dispararon y fue un gran éxito. En las revistas llegaron a adaptarse 26 relatos de un reputado escritor de ciencia ficción como lo era entonces Ray Bradbury. La competencia copió la tendencia e inundó el mercado de cómics de terror. Para conservar su liderazgo, ECE hubo de subir todavía más el grado de violencia.
They were horribly gruesome. They were bloody. People were being chopped up and battered with axes. And I'm 9 or 10. I'd never seen anything like this. It was amazing.
Horror comics were, you know, to my little 7, 8-year-old self, they were my pornography. And this was the stuff that I knew I shouldn't be looking at, but, you know, I couldn't give it up.
They were sensational.
They reached deeper and deeper into the springboard barrel. The stories got bloodier and bloodier. Did it go overboard? Yeah, I think so in a couple of spots.
I didn't write it, but I drew it. And I felt very bad about that. Mothers and fathers say, I don't want my kid to read that.
They were controversial.
Well, do you think that this cover is in bad taste? And Bill said, no, I don't think so. How would it be in bad taste? And he said, well, if you showed the gore, drop dripping from it. And they nailed him with that.
And ultimately, they were outlawed.
I think they were all completely shocked when the Senate subcommittee came forward and said, you people are the cause of juvenile delinquency.
The horror comics were a very convenient target, and the powers that be took advantage of that.
My name is William Gaines.
On April 22nd, 1954, William M. Gaines, publisher of entertaining comics, testified before the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency.
I was the first publisher in these United States to publish horror comics. I'm responsible. I started them. Some may not like them. That's a matter of personal taste. It would be just as difficult to explain the harmless thrill of a horror story to a Dr. Wortham as it would be to explain the sublimity of love to a frigid old maid. What are we afraid of? Are we afraid of our own children? Do we forget that they are citizens too and entitled to the essential freedom to read? Or do we think our children so evil, so vicious, so simple-minded that it takes but a comic magazine story of murder to set them to murder, of robbery to set them to robbery?
Just 4 years earlier, Gaines had revolutionized the medium by launching a new trend in comic books: horror. EC's graphically gory tales, while immensely popular with readers, would soon draw the wrath of both parents and politicians and threaten to destroy the entire comic book industry. It could be said that Bill Gaines had comics in his blood. His father, Max, was a pioneer in the medium, creating the first comic book, Famous Funnies, in 1934. 4 years later, Gaines joined ranks with Superman publisher Harry Donenfeld and launched a new line, All-American Comics. Featuring such superheroes as the Green Lantern and Wonder Woman, the AA line was extremely popular, with sales soaring to over 8 million copies per month. Comic books made Max Gaines a fortune. In early 1945, he sold his share of All-American for $500,000. He created a new company, Educational Comics, or EC, which published such sedate titles as Picture Stories from the Bible. Not surprisingly, EC's sales languished near the bottom of the industry.
Educational comics were pretty much like educational everything. Nobody wanted to buy them. That's why slowly but surely educational comics morphed into entertaining comics.
Max Gaines changed his company's name and direction, but not its fortunes. Sales continued to lag as children ignored EC in droves. Bill Gaines also wanted nothing to do with his father's comic books. In fact, Bill wanted no part of the family business. Max Gaines had an explosive temper, and Bill often found himself the target of his father's wrath.
From all accounts, the relationship between Bill Gaines and his father was a very hard one and a little bit abusive on the edge. Max Gaines had built his comic book company out of nothing and was very impatient with artists and writers, and apparently with his son as well.
He considered Bill the world's biggest klutz. And Bill often tried to live down to that. Max constantly said to Bill, "You'll never amount to anything."
Bill did his best to stay out of his father's way. After a stint in the Army Air Corps, he enrolled at New York University to pursue his teaching credential. Then in 1947, tragedy struck. Max was killed in a boating accident near the family's summer home on Lake Placid. Prodded by his mother, Bill reluctantly took over the reins at EC.
Bill was not enthusiastic about the idea. His father had been failing. The business owed already about $100,000. Things weren't looking good when he came in. And Bill said, "How do you expect me to do this? My father didn't do it, and he was a pretty smart financial guy."
Gaines slowly learned the ropes and moved the comics more in line with his personal tastes. A turning point came in March 1948, when a 23-year-old artist named Al Feldstein knocked on the door at EC.
I went down to see Bill Gaines, and I showed him the stuff I'd been doing, and he was very intrigued with them. My girls, they call them headlight comics because I did kind of nubile girls with tight sweaters, you know, a la Lana Turner movies. And so he gave me a contract to do a teenage book called Going Steady with Peggy.
But before even one issue was published, the bottom fell out of the teenage craze. Feldstein agreed to tear up the contract and began working on EC's other titles, imitations of then-popular romance, western, and crime comics.
After a few years of doing this follow-the-leader thing, Feldstein and Gaines realized that this was not the way to go, and they realized that they had a common love of the old sort of lights-out, inner sanctum radio shows.
Ionized Yeast presents Lights Out, Everybody. Lights Out brings you stories of the supernatural and the supernormal, dramatizing the fantasies and the mysteries of the unknown.
One of the things that I was always fascinated with was the old radio horror shows from Arch Hobler, like The Witch's Tale and Lights Out and Inner Sanctum. And I said, why don't we do kind of gothic horror and comics, scare the pants off the kids?
Eager to take the company in a new direction, Gaines agreed to test the waters of horror. Feldstein wrote 2 stories, The Crypt of Terror and The Vault of Horror, which ran in EC's crime comics. Sales improved overnight. Gaines immediately canceled EC's current line and launched what he called a new trend in magazines. In January 1950, The Crypt of Terror and The Vault of Horror hit the newsstands. 2 other titles, The Haunt of Fear and Crime Suspense Stories, soon followed. After 3 issues, Gaines changed the title of The Crypt of Terror to Tales from the Crypt. It would become EC's biggest seller. Early stories featured standard scare fare, such as mummies, vampires, and haunted houses. Gaines and Feldstein soon developed their own signature. Simple tales of good and evil, which culminated in an ironic and usually deadly ending.
Every one of those stories would have a twist. Most of those twists were the just dessert twists. That is, whenever there was a really bad person in these comics, they would indeed get their comeuppance, usually in the same way they were delivering it to others.
In one story, titled Taint the Meat, It's the Humanity, a mild-mannered butcher named Zach Gristle tries to boost profits by selling spoiled meat to his unsuspecting customers.
Pack your things, Sarah. We're leaving town.
You're in trouble. They found out. I warned you not to sell horse meat.
It's worse than that, Sarah. 4 people are dead already. I sold them tainted meat.
You what? You're a murderer.
I did it for us, Sarah. For you and me and Junior.
Junior? He's eating at Herbie Horton's house.
Horton? She bought some of it.
I feel sick, Mommy. Junior, baby. He's dead, Zach. Dead. You killed him, too. Our son.
Sarah, put down that knife. Good Lord.
Tainted meat? Tainted meat? Anyone?
EC pioneered dozens of new and ghastly methods of comeuppance. Villains were eaten by ghouls, skewered on swords, buried alive, stuffed down garbage disposals, even southern fried. It gave new meaning to the term, an eye for an eye.
In EC Comics and in much of horror, there's a code that allows the bad guy or the evil force or whatever it is to be, if not vanquished, at least put at bay at the end so we can walk out safely.
Gaines and Feldstein mixed their horror with an element which would become an EC trademark, humor. Its source was quite often the story's narrator, a device they also borrowed from an old radio show.
I had remembered the old witch in The Witch's Tale, and I remember her cackling and laughing and saying, I'm 103 years old today, Satan, and I've got a scary story to tell all my listeners.
And now, Satan, if everybody'll just douse out them lights and make it nice and dark, we'll get right down to business. Draw up to the fire and gaze into them bugs. Gaze into them deep.
Feldstein created a trio of ghoulish hosts who welcomed readers into the world of the macabre, the Crypt Keeper, the Vault Keeper, and the Old Witch.
Peanuts, popcorn. Yep, it's your feeder of foul fables, the Old Witch cooking again. Got a circus recipe for you this time.
The humor was a very vital element of these books because if you took these stories out of context, some of them were pretty grisly and some of them were not children's fare. But by having them full of these bad horror puns and having the host come in and wisecrack about them, they kind of took the edge off the horror.
By using the horror hosts, EC kept a perspective on what they were doing, and they reminded their readers that this was fiction and it was entertainment. Certainly it was entertainment. The ghoul lunatics kept the comic horror books comic.
This mix of humor and horror had a tremendous influence on children's author R.L. Stine.
When I started writing these scary books for kids, I thought back to the EC comics and how much I loved them, and I tried to remember what it was about them that I loved so much. And I remembered that it was that amazing mix of horror and humor. There was always a funny twist. People were always making horrible puns about it. It was funny. And it's sort of what I try to do at a much gentler level in my books.
You know, the whole thing was a big joke to Bill. He wanted to publish and have fun and see if he could do stories the way he liked to do it and hope that he made money.
Gaines succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. Although his horror comics didn't match the total sales of Superman, they outsold almost every other comic on a percentage basis, propelling the company into the black.
I think Dad was very surprised that they were as successful as they were. He knew that it was something that he liked and enjoyed, but he wasn't quite sure if anybody else would really enjoy it too. So I think he was surprised and very happy.
An avid reader of science fiction, Gaines followed the horror books with weird science and weird fantasy. Featuring futuristic tales of flying saucers and alien worlds, EC's science fiction books never attained the same level of popularity and success as the horror comics. Yet they are considered by many to be classics of the genre. Although neither man had formal training as a writer, Gaines and Feldstein shared the title of editor. Together, they plotted most of EC's horror and science fiction stories.
Gaines would come in with what he called springboards, and they were story ideas, which he got from reading other books, going to movies, and he would pitch them to Feldstein, and Feldstein would turn down the first one and the second one and the fifth one, and someplace around idea number 14, Feldstein would get interested and said, yeah, I can make that work.
Feldstein would then write the story himself, laying it out directly onto the illustration board, which the artist would use to draw the panels. Each horror book had 4 stories, and it was up to Gaines and Feldstein to create one new tale every day. Scrounging for plots, Gaines read everything he could get his hands on, liberally borrowing from some of the best writers in the field.
Bill would come in with these springboards. He wouldn't tell me what source they were because he didn't want me to steal the story. And he brought in a couple of springboards for science fiction stories, and I liked 2 of them. And I combined them into something called Home to Stay.
But Gaines's springboards turned out to be 2 existing stories by Ray Bradbury, then a best-selling author. Bradbury noticed the unauthorized adaptation and wrote to Gaines.
We got a letter from Ray Bradbury. Hey, you guys, you neglected to pay me my royalties for the 2 stories you swiped. And Bill said, oh, you know, we didn't know how to get in touch with you. And he said, but we'd love to pay you for it. And how about letting us adopt your stories into comics?
With Bradbury's blessing, Feldstein would go on to adapt 26 of the author's short stories. Each one became an instant comic book classic.
Because he is our premier short story writer, his stories were made to order for EC. Every time you think of one of these stories, you tend to rank it as a masterpiece.
Doing the Bradbury adaptations inspired me to be a better writer. And I think that's what EC is really noted for, was that we kind of elevated the level of storytelling to a greater height than had been attained prior in comic books.
EC's stable of artists included some of the most talented men ever to work in the field. Gaines gave them top billing, allowing them to sign their pages, and even publishing their biographies inside the front cover. More importantly, he gave them creative freedom.
Early on, I said to Bill, you know, most comic books have a kind of a sameness to them. I said, what we've got to do is encourage our artists to write in their own handwriting, not to imitate, but to each have their own style.
The styles ran the gamut from squeaky clean to gothically grotesque. Into the latter category fell Graham Ingalls. A painter by training, Ingalls developed a special knack for horror, which earned him the nickname Ghastly.
Graham Ingalls was the greatest guy at drawing walking dead, pieces of flesh falling from bodies. He had this way of getting a texture on the people he was drawing that no one else ever got with this rotten comic book reproduction. Somehow you just felt things oozing out of pores when he drew things.
Graham Ingalls had this way of drawing people, and he made them look like melting wax. There was a feeling of decay about his drawings that was just so appealing in a very kind of under-the-skin way. I remember looking at his drawings when I was a kid and imagining I could smell it.
At the opposite end of the terror spectrum was Jack Kamen.
Jack Kamen was an illustrator, a very straight kind of illustrator, and he did very pretty girls. Everybody was nice and handsome. I called him the Father Knows Best artist.
Kamen's style was best suited for EC's crime stories, which typically involved love triangles. EC often borrowed plot elements from James M. Cain, whose novels Double Indemnity and The Postman Always Rings Twice were made into very successful movies.
Fix everything for us.
What? Pray for something to happen to Nick?
Something like that.
Both Postman and Double Indemnity featured a gorgeous wife who plotted with her boyfriend to kill her husband. Kamen's stories usually included both of these elements.
I'm going to kill her, Jean, just like you want. I've made up my mind.
It's the only way, darling. The only way. I knew you'd finally see it.
Of course, in EC's world, as in Cain's, the wife and boyfriend would usually get it themselves in the end. Somewhere in between the styles of Ingalls and Kamen fell EC's other main artists, Johnny Craig and Jack Davis. Craig, the senior member of the staff, was one of the few artists who also wrote his stories. He became the man behind the Vault Keeper, illustrating all of the covers for the Vault of Horror.
Johnny Craig's characters had these severe perspiration problems whenever anything bad happened around them. And you could kind of feel that through the page. You almost felt the page would get damp from all that sweat dripping on it.
Unlike Feldstein and Gaines, who often poured on the gore, Craig focused on the terrors of the mind, the psychological aspects of horror. Considered EC's most popular artist, Jack Davis specialized in physical horror. But Davis, who would later become a highly successful humorist and commercial artist, also had an inherent comic style. He imparted a light touch on even the most horrifying scene.
I love to draw cartoons, and I'm not an illustrator. I think sometimes your illustrators draw just, you know, the stark thing right there. But if I see something, I'll put a cartoon movement on it, an action movement that I would put on a cartoon and exaggerate maybe the hands and the feet and the expression, you know, and really go at it.
That guy just makes me laugh. Even when he's drawn a gross out, he just makes me laugh. There's just something about Jack Davis's stuff that really blows me away.
Probably all of the artists who drew for EC did their best work of their careers during that short time that they were at EC. And that was no accident. That was because Bill found out what they liked to do, and they built the stories around that.
2 years into their reign of horror, Gaines and Feldstein continued to blaze new trails. In 1952, they launched a new title, Shock Suspense Stories, which featured a series of stories they called Preachies, moralistic tales which took on some of the most explosive issues of the day.
What does it say, Dave?
It says, "Don't move in, Jew. You'll be sorry. We don't want Jews in this neighborhood."
Hate was the story of a group of neighborhood vigilantes who try to scare a Jewish family out of town. The situation spirals out of control, and the family is killed. The leader of the vigilantes, John, later makes a shocking discovery.
I never intended to tell you, John. I never had to. Yes, you're adopted.
Ma!
Your parents, your real parents, were Jewish.
Suddenly, the roles were reversed, and the hater becomes the hated. John gets to experience his bigotry firsthand.
Can't you see how wrong we've been?
Scram, Jew!
I think Dad liked to be cutting edge. I believe that by touching on areas such as anti-Semitism was just his way of pushing the envelope a little, seeing how far he could go.
I was stunned by the implications of many of the stories they did. These were adult themes. And in a way, they were more shocking than the horror stories because they dealt with reality in a very direct way.
Gaines and Feldstein also turned the spotlight on race relations, a topic which, in the early 1950s, was just beginning to bubble to the surface of public discussion.
He's come home, Andrew. Our Joey's come home, a hero.
The whole town's proud of him, Marcia. The whole town. Look at him.
But Joey learns that Hank, the soldier who saved his life by jumping on a live grenade, was not good enough to be buried in the town cemetery. In the story's final page, Joey confronts the people of his hometown.
I had a buddy in Korea. We fought for democracy together. He gave his life for that cause. But when his body was sent back here, it wasn't good enough to be buried in Fair Lawn Cemetery. It wasn't good enough because its skin wasn't the right color. What did he die for? What did I give my arm for? You say you're proud of me? Well, I'm not proud of you. I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed of you and for you.
We were kind of appealing to better our society, and there were people out that didn't want to better our society. They wanted the status quo.
In 1952, EC launched a new kind of comic book that would tackle the status quo head-on. Its title was simply Mad. Masterfully written and edited by Harvey Kurtzman, Mad initially spoofed EC's own comics. Kurtzman soon turned his sights to other targets, and Mad became a runaway hit.
I think the third issue or so, he did The Lone Stranger, and then the one where Mad really took off was Super Duper Man. He did a takeoff of Superman, and it was hysterical, and that was the beginning of Mad.
By 1953, Bill Gaines had become one of the most successful publishers in the comic book industry, disproving his father's prophecy that he would never amount to anything.
He was very, very proud that he was able to prove his dad wrong and, turn a business that was suffering into an enormous financial and creative success.
EC's success did not go unnoticed by the other publishers, who soon flooded the newsstands with imitations. By 1953, nearly a quarter of all comic books sold dealt with horror. Gaines, once the trend follower, was now the trend setter.
The other companies did try to copy EC, but I think that they missed the point. They made the mistake of thinking that it was the gore and the sensational element that made these comic books successful. So, of course, they upped the ante on the gore.
This constant competition and one-upsmanship forced Gaines and Feldstein to raise the level of violence in their stories.
Frankly, as they reached deeper and deeper into the springboard barrel, the stories got bloodier and bloodier. Did it go overboard? Yeah, I think so in a couple of spots.
One spot was Foul Play, the story of a baseball team which exacts grisly revenge against an opponent who has murdered one of their teammates.
There's no doubt about it. Satin's our murderer. Traces of poison are still on his spikes. This is a job for the police.
No, wait. Let's take care of him ourselves. Our way.
On the last page, the killer is dismembered and his body parts used as baseball equipment.
I think it's kind of a natural phenomenon to try and top yourself. And yeah, we did step into what might be called extremes in some of the stuff we did, where we became a little gorier than we should have.
Stories like Foul Play encouraged critics to step up their attacks. The most vocal critic was Frederick Wortham, a New York psychiatrist who had worked with troubled teens. Wortham's attack on comic books began in 1948, when he called the medium pollution from which children had to be protected. In the spring of 1954, Wortham's book, Seduction of the Innocent, was published. Promoted as the most shocking book of the year, it was a scathing indictment of all comic books.
Wortham, of course, as a psychiatrist, read everything into these comic books you possibly could. He talked about a homoerotic relationship between Batman and Robin. He talked about the lesbian tendencies of Wonder Woman. It was preposterous.
Wortham saved his harshest attacks for horror and crime comics, which he alleged were a direct cause of juvenile delinquency. These claims touched off a firestorm of criticism against the comics industry. PTA and church groups organized boycotts. Others took even more drastic measures.
There were comic book burnings that were, of course, reminiscent of the Nazi years. Nobody intended that precisely, but when you saw some of these ugly scenes of towns where they would get all the comic books together and just burn them up, it was quite frightening.
The controversy quickly drew the attention of political leaders, and the U.S. Senate Subcommittee to investigate juvenile delinquency agreed to look into the matter. Led by Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver, the panel held hearings in New York City on April 21, 1954. The star witness was none other than Dr. Frederick Wortham.
It is my opinion, without any reasonable doubt and without any reservation, that comic books are an important contributing factor in many cases of juvenile delinquency.
Wortham worked from an improper premise. That is, he decided that the troubled children that he was analyzing read comic books. Therefore, that was a source of their trouble. And of course, there were plenty of children reading comic books who were leading perfectly normal lives, and in fact, most of them were very happy.
As adults, we get to a certain age, and all of a sudden we stop being inside, we stop wanting to take chances. We start being more afraid of the world, and we start protecting our children. We don't realize what it was like to be a kid. And so here comes Seduction of the Innocent. Claims that these comic books are going to turn us kids into juvenile delinquents. Well, poor guy, I have news for him. They turned me into a movie director. I didn't become a juvenile delinquent. This guy's dead wrong. Dead wrong.
Although many of the attacks were directed at other publishers, Bill Gaines asked for and was granted permission to testify before the committee.
Well, I had gone to New York from college to take 1 year at the Art Students League on the GI Bill. And I'd go to school at night, and I'd go around during the day and try to sell a strip, and comic strip, wanted to be syndicated. And I walked around and I couldn't find any work or anything. I went around to all of the big syndicates, and every one of them, I'd send in there and they'd look my work over. I'd have to come back maybe next week and pick it up or something. And every time I did, they didn't give you a pink slip. They just said, it's just, we don't need it, we don't like it, and that's it. So I tucked my tail and get out, man, and that was depressing. So I started looking around at the magazine racks and the comic books, and they had a lot of romance magazines, and I couldn't do romance. And then they had this horror bit, and I said, that might do. So I went down to EC Comics in Lower Manhattan on Canal Street, and went in and showed them my work, and they said, this is horrible, we like it. So so then, from then on, they gave me a script, and I'd take that script home and pencil a drawing, and and then bring it in, and they would okay it. And I'd pick up a check on the spot, and I keep saying that, telling everybody that you didn't have to bill them or anything. You brought the work in, and they'd pick up another script, and they'd write you out a check. And that's where I started working very, very fast. It was a big family, and what was so great that, you didn't have to actually go in there and work. You would take a script home with you. And when we were first married, we lived in a small apartment in Scarsdale, and I worked practically in the living room when we were first married, and then I went to a smaller room like a nursery, and you'd bring your work home. And you'd go back in maybe, and I, started doing that about once a week. So it wasn't really like punching a clock or anything. You'd call them up and tell them I'm coming in, and they'd have a script ready, and they'd pay you, and so it was great. And then they'd come in and go to lunch with some of the other artists to bring in their work in, and that was great. That's the only way I got to know them. Gaines was a big, abrupt kind of guy, and in a way kind of shy. And in the beginning, I was frightened. I was afraid of him because he was the big man, and he was gruff, and he was always polite and nice. But he was a very giving person. He would give bonuses. Like I said, he'd give you a check when you come in, and he'd give parties, and give Christmas parties, and of all things, that was so great that he took all of the mad artists on all of these trips. That I have no way that I would have ever gone there to all of these places. And we've been to, South America, Dutch Guiana, been to France and to Germany, Italy, Sicily, Northern Africa, Kenya, and all around in there. Been to Japan, been to Bangkok. We have been to Tahiti, and that was all gratis. I mean, and we'd go for a week, and it would be just the men. But eventually, the wives would go along, and that kind of put a damper on things, and it wasn't as much fun. But Bill was a very generous person. Well, I was when you watch the news, and there stands Kefauver, and there still stands Bill Gaines, your publisher, and they are making fun of him and showing things maybe that I had drawn or somebody else had drawn that was bloody, or somebody firing a pistol, and that all of a sudden hit home. And I don't like to really influence some kid to do bad things or whatever. And I might be a hypocrite, but I go to church, every Sunday. I did go to church then, and I was a scoutmaster. I had Sunday school classes, so, but I didn't really realize what, I was doing. Again, as part of growing up, I was very young, and I was not wealthy, and the money meant a lot, and EC was my income then. I mean, that was it, even though I didn't have a salary from them or anything like that, so I depended on that, and I just really didn't hit me. And as you get older, you think a lot more, and you become a little more wiser and the whole bit, and I don't have to, work for something like that anymore. And
okay, all right, good.
just kind of distasteful. Along, you know, cranking out all of the horror bit, you know, and some of it was kind of gruesome in the whole bit, and then I get a script, and I really didn't want to do it at the time, but because I was who I wasn't the boss, and everybody else is doing it, and so I did the script. I didn't write it, but I drew it, and I felt very bad about that, and of course, everybody really jumped on that because it was awful, but again, it was kind of funny, but nowadays it would be nothing. But in those days, I guess it was really something, and mothers and fathers say, I don't want my kid to read that. Wally Wood knocked me out, and he was influenced by Alex Raymond and Harold Foster. I mean, he could draw like them, and he was so good, and his color and his imagination and everything, it really impressed me. And then Graham Ingalls, who did The Witch and all that, his stuff, I didn't like it at the time, but as the more I went back and looked at it, the guy was an artist, and his paintings were unbelievable. You know, his oil paintings. He could have been a great illustrator.